In this movie, I'm going to continue and complete the GUI configuration for the inventory. Now, what I want to do is we have a canvas component here, and I want to create a panel that is going to effectively be the container for the inventory. So I'm going to select the canvas object, right click and choose UI and then choose panel. That appears outside the recording window, but the context menu does contain mention of panel there. So I'm going to select the panel object that you can see has been added here. And I'm in fact going to call this item list because it's going to house all of the items in the inventory. Now by default, the panel is sized to the screen and that is far too large. I'm going to choose the Rect Transform tool here, just making sure that is selected, and then use my mouse cursor to kind of drag that panel down here. So I'm going to set this to maybe something like this. I'm going to set the anchors for this object to be aligned to the bottom of the screen here. So something like this. I'm going to perhaps just reduce this maybe to something like 77.5. That should house the items quite nicely here. Again, I'm going to darken up this panel, and you can do that easily by scrolling down inside the object inspector, moving down to the color field here. I'm going to click on the color field and the color picker will appear. I'm just going to darken up that panel to maybe something like this and accept those changes here. So we have our basic panel, and I want to now start adding items to it. So I'm going to, for example, right click on the item list and create a new UI object, and this time I'm going to select image. This is going to be the icon representation of a single item within the inventory. So I'm going to select image and I will call this object item slot because it's going to represent a single item inside the inventory. Now by default, this is aligned to the center of the item list, but we're going to be changing this shortly because what I want to do is to come back to the item list view and select that here. And what I can do is I can choose component layout and then choose the horizontal layout group. This will allow us to align multiple items together into a horizontal line. So I'm going to choose horizontal layout group. When I do that, by default, the item here is stretched to fit its container. That's okay. I'm going to leave that as it is for the moment. I'm going to scroll down in the object inspector to take a look at the horizontal layout group here. Now by default, it's going to stretch and expand the width and the height of objects. I don't want it to do that. I don't want it to adjust the width of them. So I'm going to disable the tick box from width here, and suddenly the object disappears completely. Now to handle this scenario, I'm going to go back to the item slot and give this a minimum width. Now we don't have the necessary component to be able to do that, but I can select the item slot, choose component, choose layout, and then I can add a layout element component. So I'm going to select layout element and scroll down here. And for the min width field, I'm going to enable this and type in the minimum width of 128. And notice that when I do this, suddenly we get a representation of this object inside the inventory panel. Now I don't want the object aligned immediately to the left-hand side of the inventory like that. I want some space to be left between the edge of the screen and the leftmost side of this object. To fix that, I'm going to select the item list here. And for this padding section, for the horizontal layout group inside the object inspector, I can increase this left field and increase some padding to the left-hand side of the screen. I'm going to set this to a value of 30 to space this away from the side here, and things are looking pretty good. Now, the great thing about this is that I can come back to the item slot, for example, and I can now duplicate it, let's say twice, and you'll see that in duplicating that, it's stacking together the duplicates side by side automatically. I did not have to align these manually. In fact, I can go back to the item list here, and under the padding section, or just beneath it, I have a spacing field. And I can increase the spacing field to increase the spacing between elements here, so you can start to see that the spacing is taking effect. I'm going to set the spacing here to maybe about 40 to include some spacing between the different elements, and I can include some more elements into the inventory just by Control D on the keyboard to duplicate them to add as many different elements to the inventory as I need. Now what's going to happen, of course, is all of these items are going to begin invisible. And as we collect the different items, we're going to have an icon representation for each being added as the sprites for these images. So if I select, for example, the item slot here, you can see in the Object Inspector for the image component, we have a source image field which is set to none. And we can insert sprites into these fields to give them a sprite representation. For example, I have a box texture, I have a cylinder texture and a sphere texture down here inside the project panel. These are simply textures that I created in Photoshop. I can drag and drop, for example, the box icon into the sprite field and release my mouse. And when I do this, this replaces the image here and is included inside the inventory. This would be the representation for collecting the box. I'm just going to press Ctrl Z to undo that because I don't know, for example, that the box will be collected first. This leftmost object is the first item collected, the second here, the third here, and so on. But what we've done here is we've configured this canvas object to incorporate all the GUI elements that we need, and all we need to do now is approach the task of scripting.